I was watching my favorite television show when my son-in-law walked in and shut it off. "Enough of this trash. In this house we watch smart things," he said. My daughter just stood there and nodded along. I quietly went upstairs. The next day when they got home from work, they started pounding on the door and screaming nonstop. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to entitled family members who completely underestimated your true worth. My name is Harrison Caldwell. I am 70 years old. Up until that Tuesday evening, I believed I was doing what any loving father would do in my situation. I was providing. When my beautiful wife Diana passed away 3 years ago, a massive echoing void opened up in my life. The big empty house we had planned to retire in suddenly felt like a quiet museum of ghosts. At the exact same time, my daughter Natalie, who was 38, and her husband Derek, who was 42, were constantly complaining to me about their cramped apartment in the city. Derek was a self-proclaimed tech entrepreneur. He was always on the verge of some massive artificial intelligence breakthrough. He talked endlessly about algorithms and disrupting markets, but I rarely saw any actual revenue disrupt his personal bank account. I made a major decision that I genuinely thought was an act of grace. I purchased a sprawling, immaculate $3 million mansion in a highly exclusive, gated community. I told Natalie and Derek they could move in with me. The arrangement was supposed to be simple and mutually beneficial. They could live completely rent-free, allowing Derek to pour all his financial resources into his tech startup, and in return, I would not have to live completely alone during my grieving years. I thought I was giving them the ultimate launchpad. I truly thought I was being a good, supportive father. But I quickly learned that immense gratitude has a very short shelf life when it is handed to the entirely wrong people. It was a quiet, peaceful evening. I was sitting on my custom leather sofa, enjoying a cold glass of iced tea and watching a historical documentary about the Industrial Revolution. It was an old, gritty black and white film showing men forging steel building sprawling railroads and laying the heavy foundations of the modern world with their bare, blistered hands. It deeply reminded me of my own rough roots. I was entirely engrossed in the program. The volume was set to a very reasonable level. I was absolutely not bothering anyone. Suddenly I heard the rapid, heavy thud of aggressive footsteps echoing loudly on the imported marble floors of the grand hallway. Derek strode directly into the living room. He wore his usual pristine designer sneakers, neatly tailored joggers, and a soft cashmere sweater draped casually over his shoulders. He was always perfectly playing the role of a brilliant visionary without actually putting in the grueling hours required. Without a single word of greeting, he walked straight past. The glass coffee table stood directly in front of the television set and rudely snatched the remote control right from the armrest next to my hand. He aimed it directly at the screen and firmly pressed the power button. The glowing screen instantly went black. The sudden silence in the vast open room was incredibly deafening. I blinked my eyes, genuinely caught completely off guard by his sheer audacity. "Excuse me," I said, keeping my voice surprisingly calm but heavily laced with pure confusion. "I was actually watching that." Derek did not even attempt to look apologetic. In fact, his sharp face instantly twisted into a dark sneer of pure, unfiltered condescension. "Enough of this trash," he said coldly, tossing the remote control carelessly onto the hard glass table. "In this house, we only watch smart things. You are completely rotting your brain with these ancient, depressing history channels. It is bringing down the whole vibe." I sat perfectly frozen. The arrogant words echoed loudly in my ringing ears. In this house. He had actually just said in this house. The massive house that I personally bought with my own hard-earned cash. The expensive house that legally had my name printed boldly on the property deed. The beautiful house where he was currently living entirely on my generous dime. I slowly turned my heavy head toward the wide archway. Natalie had just walked right in. She was holding a tall, sweating glass of sparkling water, with a thin slice of lemon, looking completely unbothered by her husband's blatant, shocking disrespect. I stared intensely at my only daughter, desperately waiting for her to intervene. I was waiting for her to firmly correct the arrogant man she had married, and quickly remind him exactly who was putting the expensive roof over his entitled head. Instead of defending me, Natalie just let out a heavy sigh and gave me a tired, highly dismissive look. "Dad, please just let it go for tonight," she said smoothly, taking a slow sip of her clear water. "Derek has a huge, critical pitch for his new AI project coming up tomorrow morning. He desperately needs clear mental space and high positive energy. The loud noise from those old depressing war and factory shows is just far too distracting for his creative process. He really needs a high-frequency environment to properly focus." A high-frequency environment. I silently tasted the incredibly bitter irony of her ridiculous, empty corporate buzzwords. I looked slowly back at Derek. He was already pulling out his sleek smartphone, mindlessly scrolling through his incoming text messages, completely dismissing my physical presence in the room, as if I were just a piece of old, outdated furniture taking up entirely too much space in his modern art gallery. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I did not waste my breath reminding them of the massive mortgage, the hefty property taxes, or the enormous utility bills I quietly paid every single month. Engaging and arguing with ungrateful fools only drags a man down to their miserable level. I simply placed my sweating glass of iced tea gently onto a small coaster, stood up slowly, and walked quietly toward the grand staircase. As I began to ascend the carpeted stairs, my right hand tightly gripped the heavy polished oak banister. The dark wood was perfectly smooth and cold, but in that specific moment it felt exactly like a grounding wire. As I squeezed the hard banister, the sheer rushing adrenaline of my deeply silent rage transported me vividly back through time. My sharp mind flashed back exactly 40 years. I saw myself clearly at 30 years old, standing knee-deep in freezing, filthy mud at a chaotic construction site before the morning sun had even decided to come up. I had built my massive heavy machinery rental empire, Caldwell Equipment and Logistics, entirely from raw dirt and sheer willpower. I remembered the thick, suffocating smell of dark diesel fuel that soaked into my rough skin so deeply that absolutely no amount of harsh scrubbing could ever wash it completely away. I distinctly remembered the agonizing, blinding pain of a crushed left finger caught violently in a heavy hydraulic press. I had to wrap it tightly in a dirty, greasy rag and go right back to grueling work because I absolutely could not afford to lose a single lucrative business contract. I remembered the difficult year Diana and I had absolutely nothing to our names. We lived in a tiny, drafty one-bedroom apartment with a broken radiator that barely worked in the winter. I worked brutal 18-hour shifts moving heavy earth and lifting cold steel just so that on our 5th wedding anniversary, I could finally afford to buy her a beautiful, simple blue dress. The look of pure, unadulterated joy on her face when she unboxed it was worth every single drop of my blood and sweat. Diana truly understood sacrifice. If Diana were miraculously alive and standing right in that living room today, she would have physically thrown Derek out the heavy front door for daring to speak to me in such a disrespectful manner. She would have been totally heartbroken to see what our daughter had sadly become, a passive enabler to an arrogant, empty suit. I entered my dark bedroom and closed the heavy door firmly behind me. The initial stunning shock of their disrespect completely vanished. It evaporated into the quiet, air-conditioned room. What replaced it was not sorrow. It was not self-pity. It was a cold, calculated, and absolute fury. They looked at me and saw an old retired man who was simply waiting out his final years. They thought my silence was weakness. They thought my generosity was stupidity. They truly believed that because I had stepped away from the daily operations of my empire, I had lost my teeth. I walked over to the large bay window overlooking the expansive, manicured backyard. The automated sprinklers were hissing to life in the darkness. I crossed my arms behind my back. If my son-in-law thought I was just some clueless old fossil who could be easily pushed around in my own territory, he had made the most fatal miscalculation of his pathetic career. I was Harrison Caldwell. I had eaten men like him for breakfast in the corporate world. They wanted a high-frequency environment. I was going to give them a hurricane. and they had absolutely no idea what was coming for them tomorrow. The next morning broke with a crisp, bitter chill. I sat quietly alone at the massive, heavy mahogany dining table drinking my black coffee and simply watched them. Derek came bounding down the stairs in another tailored suit, talking loudly into his phone about algorithms and venture capital. He did not even look in my direction. Natalie followed shortly after, dressed in a designer pantsuit I had paid for last Christmas. She gave me a brief, obligatory nod before rushing out the front door. The heavy oak door slammed shut, echoing through the vast, silent mansion. I waited exactly 15 minutes. I watched from the front window as Derek's imported sports car backed out of the long driveway and disappeared down the street. The moment they were gone, the lingering tension in the house completely vanished. I set my coffee cup down. It was finally time to go to work. I picked up my phone and made a single call to a private rapid response security firm I had used for my equipment lots back in the day. Within 45 minutes, a discreet white van pulled through my front gates. 3 technicians in gray uniforms stepped out. I gave them very clear, very specific instructions. I wanted every single smart lock, every keypad, and every biometric scanner on the property completely wiped and reset. I watched as they systematically dismantled the digital access Derek had so proudly installed. They ripped out the old modules and replaced them with highly encrypted systems synced exclusively to my personal phone. Derek thought he controlled the infrastructure of my home because he knew how to program a keypad. He forgot that I was the man who owned the walls the keypads were drilled into. By noon, the $3 million mansion was a completely sealed fortress. No one was getting in without my direct manual authorization. The technicians finished their meticulous sweep, handed me the new master controls, and drove away quietly, leaving me entirely alone in my secured sanctuary. With the perimeter secure, I walked upstairs to the master guest suite. It was the largest room on the second floor, a room they had aggressively claimed as their own the moment they moved in. I opened the door and surveyed the absolute mess of their entitlement. Expensive clothes were thrown carelessly across the velvet chairs. High-end electronics cluttered the large oak desk. Empty coffee cups and expensive skin creams were scattered everywhere. I went down to the garage and brought up 3 boxes of heavy-duty black industrial trash bags. I did not fold anything. I did not organize anything. I simply opened the bags and started clearing the room. I grabbed armfuls of Derek's cashmere sweaters, his custom-tailored shirts, and his ridiculous collection of expensive shoes, shoving them ruthlessly into the thick plastic. I threw in Natalie's cosmetics, her designer handbags, and her extensive jewelry boxes. Every single item represented $1 of my sweat, and yet handling their possessions felt like clearing out toxic waste. It took me 2 solid hours of grueling physical labor to bag up their entire lives. My shoulders ached, and my knees protested with every trip down the stairs, but the burning adrenaline kept me moving. I dragged 20 heavy black bags out the back door, pulling them across the manicured lawn, leaving deep, messy trails in the pristine grass. I hauled them all the way to the old, unrenovated guest house at the far edge of the property. The guest house had not been used in years. It was dusty cold and smelled faintly of old wood and damp soil. The floorboards creaked loudly under my boots. It lacked central heating and certainly did not have a high-frequency environment. It was just an empty, forgotten box. I tossed their bags onto the bare floorboards in a massive, disorganized pile, locked the flimsy wooden door, and walked back to the main house. The sheer physical exertion felt incredibly satisfying. I was finally purging the infection from my home. By 6 o'clock in the evening, the sun began to dip below the tall tree line, casting long, dark shadows across the expansive estate. I went into my private study, a quiet room lined with heavy books and cherished memories of Diana. I walked over to the small crystal decanter on my side table and poured myself a generous measure of aged bourbon. The amber liquid burned pleasantly as it went down, warming my chest and settling my nerves. I sat back in my large leather armchair and turned my attention to the large monitor resting on my desk. It displayed a crisp, high-definition grid of live feeds from the newly installed security cameras. I watched the perimeter intently, waiting for the inevitable arrival. At exactly 6:45, the sleek silver sports car pulled up to the main gate. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk. I watched Derek casually roll down his window and punch his code into the access panel. Nothing happened. He punched it again, hitting the buttons significantly harder this time. The heavy wrought iron gate remained firmly shut. I could clearly see the visible frustration building in his tight shoulders. He stepped out of the low car, waving his arms indignantly at Natalie, who was staring confusedly through the passenger windshield. Derek climbed awkwardly over the low stone wall next to the gate, an incredibly undignified scramble for a man wearing a $3,000 suit. He marched aggressively up the long, winding driveway, stormed up the front brick steps, and aggressively punched his personal code into the front door pad. A small red light blinked mockingly immediately, denying him entry. He grabbed the heavy brass handle and yanked it violently. It did not budge a single inch. The harsh realization began to wash over his arrogant face. He pounded his closed fist against the solid oak wood. The dull, rhythmic sound echoed faintly through the thick walls of the silent house, reaching me in the quiet study. Natalie soon joined him on the front porch, having abandoned the car at the gate. They were both shouting now, their faces contorted in pure, unadulterated outrage. I could not hear their exact words through the thick, soundproof glass, but the security camera perfectly captured every frantic, angry gesture. Derek kicked the bottom of the door with his expensive leather shoe. Natalie pulled out her smartphone, dialing my number frantically. My phone buzzed silently on the polished wood of my desk. I watched the screen light up with her name, but I simply ignored it. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my bourbon, feeling a profound, absolute calm wash over my tired body. The clueless old man had just permanently changed the locks on his own life. I sat alone in the dimming light, watching them throw their pathetic tantrum on the porch. They were completely locked out of the luxury they felt so profoundly entitled to. The heavy oak door stood strong between us. They had demanded I disappear, but they were the ones standing outside in the cold evening air, entirely powerless and utterly confused. I watched the security feed for 5 minutes, letting the cold air chill their bones. Derek stopped kicking the door and was pacing across the stone porch, running his hands through his hair. Natalie was frantically dialing my phone number, unable to comprehend why her demands were met with silence. I reached forward and pressed the silver button on my desktop intercom. A sharp beep echoed from the speakers mounted above the front entrance. Both of them jumped at the sudden noise, whipping their heads to stare directly into the lens of the security camera. I leaned my face close to the microphone. My voice emerged from the outdoor speakers, calm, steady, and devoid of warmth. "My house, my rules," I said, letting the simple truth hang in the quiet air for a moment. "You boldly stated that you only want smart things in your environment. You demanded that I disappear so you could have the proper mental space to focus on your brilliant tech empire. Well, I have accommodated your extremely specific request. You will find all of your belongings packed in black plastic bags out in the old guest house. You want a smart space? Go invent it in the shed." I released the button and waited. Through the glowing monitor, I observed a fascinating psychological transformation unfold. For exactly 3 seconds, Derek looked absolutely furious. His face flushed a deep red, and his jaw clenched tightly. He opened his mouth, prepared to unleash a barrage of insults. But then a stark realization washed over his features. He suddenly remembered that he was staring at a solid barricade, that the bank accounts, property deeds, and ultimate power rested entirely in my hands. The aggressive tech visionary vanished in the blink of an eye. His shoulders instantly slumped forward, abandoning his proud posture. He dropped his expensive leather briefcase onto the stone floor and brought both of his hands up to cover his face. When he pulled his hands away, Derek was actually crying. Real glistening tears were forming in the corners of his eyes, rolling slowly down his cheeks. It was a masterful, Oscar-worthy performance of utter defeat. He stepped directly up to the camera, looking up with an expression of profound, agonizing vulnerability. "Dad!" Derek pleaded, his voice cracking with heavy manufactured emotion through the audio feed. "Dad, please. I am so incredibly sorry. I was completely out of line yesterday. I was disrespectful and I was wrong. But you have to understand the immense pressure I am currently under. I did not mean a single word of what I said about your shows or you. I am drowning, Dad. My artificial intelligence startup is facing a catastrophic funding deficit. Our lead investor pulled out and our entire operational runway is collapsing. I am watching my life's work crumble into dust before my eyes. The stress is eating me alive and I took my frustrations out on the wrong person. Please, Harrison, do not throw us out like this." Right on cue, Natalie stepped into the camera frame, wrapping her arms tightly around her sobbing husband. She looked up at the lens, her own face streaked with dramatic tears, perfectly mirroring his fabricated despair. "Dad, please listen to him," she cried, her voice echoing loudly through the outdoor speakers. "Derek is falling apart. He has not slept a full night in weeks. He is working grueling 18-hour days staring at computer screens until his eyes bleed desperately trying to secure our family's future. He is on the absolute verge of a complete mental breakdown. The pressure of providing for us, of making this tech company succeed, is destroying him from the inside out. He just snapped yesterday. It was a terrible mistake born from pure blinding panic. We need you, Dad. We are so sorry. Please open the door. We have nowhere else to go." I sat back in my leather chair, taking a slow, thoughtful sip of my bourbon. I analyzed their desperate performance with the cold, detached precision of a seasoned corporate negotiator. It was a very good story. It hit all the right emotional notes. It painted Derek not as an arrogant, entitled parasite, but as a tragic, hardworking martyr breaking under the noble weight of providing for his beloved family. It framed his disrespect as a mere symptom of a much larger, heartbreaking struggle. If I were the naive, grieving old man they clearly thought I was, I would have fallen for it completely. I would have rushed downstairs, thrown open the heavy oak doors, enveloped them in a warm embrace, and offered to write a massive check to save his failing startup on the spot. But I was not that man. I had spent 40 years sitting across boardroom tables from professional liars, con artists, and desperate executives, willing to say absolutely anything to save their sinking ships. I knew what genuine panic looked like, and I knew what calculated manipulation looked like. However, I also knew that confronting them right now while they were standing on the porch would yield absolutely no strategic advantage. If I kept them locked out, they would simply spin a narrative to our extended family and friends, casting me as the cruel, heartless villain who threw his own daughter onto the street over a minor argument about a television remote. I needed them inside. I needed them to believe that their pathetic performance had worked flawlessly. I needed them to drop their guard so I could carefully observe their next moves. I leaned forward and pressed the intercom button one more time. "I accept your apology," I said, keeping my tone intentionally soft and slightly weary, playing the role of a forgiving, tired father. "I know the brutal stress of trying to build a business from nothing. It can make a man say things he deeply regrets. I am unlocking the front door now. Go out to the guest house, bring your bags back inside, and we will put this incident behind us." I pressed the override command on my desktop panel. A loud click echoed from the entryway as the deadbolts retracted. Through the monitor, I watched Derek and Natalie visibly sag with immense, overwhelming relief. They quickly wiped their faces, exchanged a very brief, highly revealing glance of quiet triumph, and hurried off toward the backyard to retrieve their trash bags. I turned off the monitor and sat in silence. They had talked their way back into the mansion, but a dark seed of doubt had firmly taken root. Derek claimed he worked 18-hour days, yet I rarely saw him leave before noon. He claimed a catastrophic funding deficit, yet my memory recalled his expensive designer clothes and endless luxury packages. He claimed the immense pressure was destroying him, yet I watched him casually drink $2,000 wine bottles every weekend, without a care. The pieces did not fit. I had willingly let the dangerous wolves back into my home, but the power dynamic had permanently changed. They thought they had manipulated a clueless old man. They had absolutely no idea they had just invited a highly observant predator to quietly start hunting them down. The very next morning, the grand house returned to its usual rhythm, but the underlying current had fundamentally changed. I sat at the head of the mahogany dining table, sipping my coffee, playing the role of the sympathetic patriarch. Derek strolled into the kitchen around 10 o'clock. He was freshly showered, humming a cheerful tune as he poured sparkling water. He did not look like a man teetering on the edge of a catastrophic financial abyss. He looked like a man who had successfully conned his way out of an eviction. As he reached across the polished granite island, the crisp morning sunlight caught something metallic and highly reflective on his left wrist. I lowered my coffee mug. It was a brand-new, heavy platinum Patek Philippe watch. I know luxury timepieces. I bought a similar model when my heavy machinery company crossed its first major milestone decades ago. That specific watch on his wrist cost north of $80,000. My gut twisted with unease. A contradiction sat in front of me. 12 hours ago, this man was sobbing on my porch, claiming his artificial intelligence startup was facing ruin, and he was drowning under a collapsed funding round. Men facing financial destruction do not buy platinum watches. They sell them. I kept my face neutral. "Beautiful watch, Derek," I said smoothly. Derek froze. His eyes darted toward his wrist, and he quickly pulled the sleeve of his sweater down. "Oh, this," he said with a nervous chuckle. "It is just a replica, Dad. A cheap knockoff I bought online to keep up appearances for investor meetings. You know how the tech world is. You have to fake it until you make it." "Of course," I replied. "Projecting success is very important." I did not believe a single syllable. It was not a replica. The seamless sweep of the second hand was undeniably authentic. My internal alarm bells were blaring. The seed of doubt planted the previous night had instantly sprouted into a tangled web of suspicion. Over the next few days, I watched him with unblinking intensity. The contradictions multiplied. The doorbell rang constantly, with deliveries from exclusive stores. Natalie strutted through the marble halls carrying bags filled with designer shoes. When I inquired about her purchases during a funding crisis, she offered the same rehearsed excuse. She claimed they urgently needed to maintain an elite image to court venture capitalists. The pinnacle of this absurdity arrived on a Friday evening. Derek announced he was hosting a highly exclusive networking dinner in the formal dining room. He claimed it was a desperate attempt to woo elusive angel investors who could save his failing company. I retreated to my private study, but kept my door cracked open to observe. A team of professional private caterers swarmed my kitchen, carrying silver trays of fresh lobster and dry aged beef. Then the specialty wine delivery arrived. I watched quietly as the sommelier carefully unpacked 2 heavy wooden crates of vintage Bordeaux. I recognized the label immediately. It was a rare vintage that retailed for exactly $2,000 a bottle. He ordered 12. That was $24,000 spent entirely on alcohol for a single evening. The math simply did not add up. Even the most reckless entrepreneur would not incinerate $24,000 on wine if their operational runway was collapsing. They would be conserving every single penny. They would not be throwing Roman feasts in my dining room. I decided I needed to push the issue. The following evening, after his lavish investor dinner had concluded and the house was quiet, I invited Derek to join me in my study for a drink. He walked in looking incredibly smug. I poured him a generous glass of scotch and gestured for him to sit. "So, Derek," I began, "I know you are under immense pressure to save your company. As a man who built a business from the dirt up, I want to understand what you are dealing with. Walk me through your business model. How exactly does your software generate revenue?" Derek shifted uncomfortably. The smug confidence vanished from his eyes, replaced by darting panic. He took a fast sip of his scotch. "Well, Dad, it is highly complex. he started, his voice adopting an artificial cadence. "We are leveraging neural networks to synergize data streams. Our objective is to disrupt legacy paradigms by implementing scalable solutions." I sat perfectly still. He had just strung together 20 complicated words that meant absolutely nothing. It was pure, unfiltered garbage. It was the kind of hollow jargon mediocre salesmen use when they are desperately trying to confuse an uneducated buyer. "I see," I said, leaning forward. "But how do you actually monetize that? Who is paying you? Are you charging subscription fees to individual consumers? What is your actual product, Derek?" He tugged nervously at the collar of his expensive shirt. "We are currently in a pre-revenue growth phase, Dad," he stammered. "We are focusing entirely on user acquisition and ecosystem integration. The monetization strategy will organically actualize once we reach critical market saturation. It is a completely different landscape than the heavy machinery rental business you ran." He was patronizing me. He was deliberately using fake industry buzzwords to make me feel out of touch. He wanted me to back down, assuming I simply lacked the mental capacity to comprehend his imaginary genius. "Of course," I replied, offering a tight smile. "Forward-looking disruption. It sounds incredibly sophisticated. I am sure you have everything completely under control." Derek visibly relaxed, clearly believing he had successfully blinded the clueless old man with his modern vocabulary. He finished his scotch and hurried out of my study. As the heavy wooden door clicked shut, the final piece of the puzzle locked firmly into place. I smelled a rat, and the stench was overpowering. Derek did not have an artificial intelligence startup. He did not have a groundbreaking product. He was entirely full of lies. Yet the brand new platinum watch on his wrist was real. The mountain of designer clothes Natalie paraded around in was real. The $24,000 worth of vintage wine sitting in my kitchen was extremely real. A new, highly dangerous conflict crystallized in my mind. If Derek was not making his money from a legitimate tech startup, and if he was not actually bankrupt like he claimed, then where exactly was this massive, endless river of cash actually coming from? Who was funding this extravagant lifestyle? I turned my chair to face the window. The anger I felt previously began to shift into something terrifying. I was not just dealing with an entitled son-in-law. I was living under the same roof as a fraud, and he was using my beautiful home to harbor his deceptions. I needed facts. I needed hard, undeniable proof. I could not rely on my own observations anymore. I needed to peel back the polished layers of Derek's fake life and expose the rotting core underneath. The time for playing the passive father was completely over. It was time to go to war. Sleep evaded me that night. My mind was an engine of strategy and suspicion. The clock glowed proudly, displaying 2 o'clock in the morning. The sprawling mansion was silent, wrapped in a suffocating stillness that only night can bring. I lay staring at the dark ceiling, my heart beating with a slow rhythm. The realization that my daughter and her husband harbored a deception under my roof made the mattress feel like nails. I needed to move. I needed to act. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed. I slipped into my leather slippers, grateful the carpeting muffled my footsteps. My mouth felt dry, parched by the simmering anger that replaced my grief. I headed downstairs to the kitchen to pour a glass of ice water. I navigated the dark hallways by memory. I did not turn on a single light switch. The moonlight filtered through the tall windows, casting shadows across the marble floors. As I descended the staircase, the silence of the house was broken. It was a mechanical whirring sound. It was highly unnatural. I assumed it was the ice maker cycling in the refrigerator, or a malfunction in the air conditioning unit. But as I reached the bottom step, I realized the noise came from the east wing of the estate. That wing housed the library, a bathroom, and the room Derek aggressively claimed as his private executive home office. The grinding sound was continuous, hungry, and loud. It sounded like an engine chewing through thick material. I abandoned my trip. My thirst was instantly forgotten. I pressed my back against the wall and moved silently toward the source of the persistent noise. As I crept closer, the metallic grinding grew louder. A thin slice of yellow light spilled out from the slightly ajar door of Derek's office, cutting a line across the hardwood floor. I stopped breathing. I slowly edged my face toward the gap in the doorway, keeping my body hidden in the deep shadows. What I saw in that room entirely validated every dark suspicion I harbored. Derek stood directly over a massive commercial paper shredder. This was not a standard home office device. It was an expensive, high-capacity machine designed to destroy massive volumes of sensitive corporate documents in minutes. The bright desk lamp illuminated his face perfectly. The arrogant, untouchable tech visionary from dinner was completely gone. In his place stood a frantic, terrified, and desperate man. His expensive cashmere sweater was discarded carelessly on the floor. His crisp dress shirt was completely unbuttoned at the collar, and dark patches of nervous sweat stained the expensive fabric under his arms. His face was flushed, and his eyes were wild with sheer, unadulterated panic. He was violently grabbing thick, heavy stacks of manila folders, glossy financial reports, and bound contracts from a large cardboard box on his desk. He shoved them aggressively into the whining teeth of the shredder. The machine groaned and choked under the massive volume of paper, but Derek just kept pushing, forcing the documents down with trembling hands. He was destroying evidence. He was actively erasing his financial history. He muttered quiet, frantic curses under his breath, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. I watched him incinerate hundreds of pages of documents. The sheer desperation in his erratic movements painted a very clear, undeniable picture. The walls were closing in on him. His imaginary empire was actively collapsing, and he was desperately trying to bury the rubble before the authorities or his dangerous private lenders came knocking on my front door. I remained perfectly frozen in the dark hallway, watching the frantic destruction. I needed those documents. I needed to know exactly what kind of criminal liability he was dragging into my home. But the shredder's razor-sharp, cross-cut teeth were turning everything into useless, microscopic confetti. Suddenly, the machine let out a loud, high-pitched beep. A bright red warning light flashed on the top panel. The internal collection bin was completely full. The safety mechanism automatically engaged, shutting the grinding motor down instantly. Derek slammed his hands down hard on the top of the machine, letting out a frustrated, angry hiss. He looked around the messy office frantically. He needed a garbage bag to empty the massive bin, but the small decorative trash can by his desk was already overflowing with empty coffee cups and crumpled napkins. He spun around, wiped the heavy sweat from his forehead, and sprinted out of the office through the secondary door that led directly to the attached garage. He was going to find a heavy-duty trash bag. I knew I had exactly 30 seconds before he returned. The moment I heard the heavy garage door click shut, I abandoned the safety of the shadows. I moved with a sudden explosive agility that entirely belied my 70 years of age. I slipped silently through the main office door. The room smelled strongly of hot, overworked electrical motors, burnt paper dust, and sour, nervous sweat. I rushed directly over to the silent machine. My primary goal was absolutely clear. I immediately reached down and yanked the thick, black power cord directly out of the wall outlet, ensuring the machine could not accidentally surge to life and announce my presence. I grabbed the sturdy plastic handle of the shredder's lower compartment and pulled firmly. The heavy drawer slid open with a soft, sliding sound. Inside was a massive, tightly packed mountain of shredded paper strips. It was a chaotic, disorganized pile of white, blue, and yellow ribbons. It was the physical manifestation of his entire criminal enterprise, conveniently contained in one single heavy plastic bin. I did not have the precious time to search for a separate bag. I simply grabbed the entire plastic drawer out of the machine. It was surprisingly heavy, filled to the absolute brim with his desperate secrets. I clutched the large bin tightly against my chest, gripping the plastic edges with my calloused hands. I turned swiftly and sprinted out of the office, my leather slippers gliding silently across the smooth hardwood floors. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, pumping fresh, hot adrenaline through my old veins. I reached the bottom of the grand staircase just as I heard the heavy, distinct sound of the garage door loudly unlatching in the distance. Derek was coming back. I took the carpeted stairs 2 at a time, ignoring the sharp, protesting ache in my knees. I moved completely, swallowed by the darkness of the upper landing. I reached my master bedroom, slipped inside, and shut the heavy door with a soft, barely audible click. I walked swiftly to my expansive walk-in closet, pushed aside a row of heavy winter coats, and shoved the overflowing bin into the deepest, darkest corner. I quickly covered the bin with an old, thick wool blanket, completely hiding the stolen evidence from view. I stood perfectly still in the dark closet, taking long, deep breaths to steady my racing heart. Downstairs, I could faintly hear the sharp, muffled sound of Derek cursing loudly. He had returned to his office to find the internal shredder bin completely missing. I smiled into the total darkness of my quiet room. The hunt had officially begun. The tension was incredibly palpable. It was a very dangerous game of cat and mouse now. I was truly ready. The morning sun rose slowly over the manicured lawns of my estate, casting long, deceivingly peaceful shadows through the tall windows. I sat in the kitchen nursing a cup of black coffee, watching my daughter and her husband prepare for their day. Derek was dressed in another immaculate, perfectly tailored suit. He babbled enthusiastically into his smartphone about scalable infrastructure and Synergy, performing his daily routine of absolute nonsense. Natalie kissed his cheek, completely enchanted by his empty vocabulary. I simply nodded and smiled as they finally walked out the heavy front doors. The moment I heard the distinct low rumble of Derek's sports car fading down the long driveway, the facade of the retired passive father completely evaporated. I immediately stood up, locked the front door, and engaged the perimeter security system. The house was entirely mine again. I walked briskly upstairs to my master bedroom, opened the dark walk-in closet, and pulled the heavy wool blanket off the stolen shredder bin. The plastic container was packed tight with the shredded ribbons of Derek's closely guarded secrets. I carried the heavy bin down the sweeping staircase and placed it squarely in the center of the massive mahogany dining table. I needed bright, unforgiving light. I turned on every single chandelier and table lamp in the room. I retrieved a pair of fine tweezers, 2 large rolls of clear adhesive tape, and several large sheets of blank white cardboard from my private study. I dumped the massive pile of shredded paper directly onto the polished wood. It looked like an impossible, chaotic mountain of white and blue confetti. There were thousands of tiny, jagged strips, deliberately sliced to hide a deeply malicious truth. A lesser man might have looked at that insurmountable pile and simply walked away. But I had spent 40 years taking apart massive, complex diesel engines piece by piece, finding the tiny, microscopic fractures in heavy steel blocks that threatened to destroy multi-million-dollar projects. Patience was not just a virtue for me. It was the very foundation of my entire empire. I pulled up a comfortable leather chair, put on my reading glasses, and went to work. The first hour was agonizingly slow. My calloused, thick fingers were built for gripping heavy wrenches and steering massive transport trucks, not delicately maneuvering millimeter-thin strips of torn paper. My joints ached with a dull, familiar throb, but I completely ignored the pain. I began sorting the shreds by color and texture. I separated the thick, glossy paper from the standard printer sheets. I looked for distinct blue ink, red warning stamps, and official letterheads. Slowly, agonizingly, the completely random chaos began to take a structured form. I taped the first 2 matching strips onto the white cardboard backing, then a third, then a fourth. The mechanical hum of the central air conditioning was the absolute only sound in the vast, empty mansion. Hour after hour ticked by on the grandfather clock in the hallway. My back grew incredibly stiff, and my eyes burned from the intense, unrelenting focus. But as the fragmented words began to align, the sheer magnitude of the deception fueled my aging body with a cold, relentless energy. By the 4th hour, a very clear, highly disturbing picture began to emerge beneath my hands. The documents I was meticulously reconstructing had absolutely nothing to do with artificial intelligence, machine learning, or cutting-edge software development. There were no complex schematics. There were no brilliant pitch decks meant for Silicon Valley venture capitalists. Instead, my eyes scanned across highly complex, convoluted financial routing numbers. I pieced together the top half of a bank statement. The logo belonged to a highly secretive, notoriously unregulated offshore shell bank located deep in the Caribbean. My heart beat with a slow, heavy rhythm as I read the reconstructed columns of tiny black numbers. There were massive, staggering wire transfers. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were being frantically shuffled between a dozen completely meaningless corporate entities. The money was moving in a rapid, chaotic circle, clearly designed to confuse anyone trying to follow the financial trail. It was a classic, undeniable layering tactic utilized by sophisticated criminals trying to hide vast amounts of stolen wealth. As I moved into my sixth grueling hour of reconstruction, I found the most damning pieces of the puzzle. These strips of paper were printed on thick, expensive legal stock bordered by bright, aggressive red ink. I carefully taped the jagged edges together, smoothing the clear adhesive over the terrifying words. They were formal, aggressive legal notices. They were final demands for the immediate repayment of misallocated investor funds. I read the reconstructed paragraphs with a sickening sense of absolute clarity. The detailed letters exposed how Derek had aggressively solicited millions of dollars from wealthy private investors, promising them astronomical, impossible returns on a revolutionary tech product that simply did not exist. He was actively using the fresh incoming cash from new investors to quietly pay off the aggressive financial demands of the older, angry investors. He was pocketing the massive, lucrative difference to personally fund his luxury sports cars, his designer clothes, and his absurdly expensive daily lifestyle. I sat back heavily into my leather chair, letting the metal tweezers drop onto the mahogany table with a sharp, echoing clink. Derek did not have a struggling tech startup. He was running a massive, fraudulent Ponzi scheme right out of my home. He was a dangerous parasite feeding on the blind trust and wealth of innocent people, using the grand, respectable facade of my $3 million mansion to falsely legitimize his criminal enterprise to his wealthy marks. The catastrophic funding deficit he had cried about on my front porch yesterday was not a tragic business failure. It was the terrifying, inevitable collapse of his illegal pyramid. He had completely run out of new gullible victims to scam, and the old victims were finally demanding their money back immediately. The fake facade was crumbling rapidly. The grim reality of the situation crashed over me like a freezing, suffocating ocean wave. Derek was not just a lazy, arrogant son-in-law trying to build a business. He was a desperate, cornered criminal facing absolute ruin. Desperate men are incredibly dangerous. If his massive fraud was officially exposed to the public, the furious, defrauded investors would legally unleash hell. The aggressive private lenders would aggressively come looking for valuable assets to seize. They would relentlessly trace his listed address right back to my front door. They would look at his lavish lifestyle, the expensive cars parked in my driveway, the imported marble floors of my secure house, and they would logically assume I was either heavily financing his illegal operation or actively hiding his stolen wealth. He had brought a highly volatile, ticking time bomb directly into my peaceful sanctuary. I carefully gathered the reconstructed cardboard sheets and locked them securely inside my heavy steel floor safe. I thoroughly cleaned the entire dining table, leaving absolutely no trace of the fine paper dust. I knew his incredibly dark secret. The power dynamic in my home had shifted entirely. It was finally time to quietly initiate a counterattack. I sat in my quiet study as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky. The heavy steel door of my floor safe was securely locked, protecting the damning puzzle I had spent the entire night piecing together. I knew heavy machinery. I knew supply chain logistics, diesel engines, and corporate acquisitions, but I also knew my limitations. I was entirely out of my depth when it came to offshore shell banks, international wire fraud, and digital cybercrimes. If I handled this incorrectly, the federal authorities would sweep into my home and freeze every single asset I had spent 40 years building. I needed a professional predator. I reached for my private desk phone and dialed a number I had not used in 5 years. Bradley Pierce answered on the second ring. Bradley was my longtime corporate attorney, a ruthless, calculating legal shark who had navigated my company through 2 brutal, hostile takeovers. He was not a man of warmth or pleasantries. He was a man of cold, hard facts and aggressive legal warfare. "Harrison," Bradley said, his voice crisp and sharp through the receiver. "It has been a long time. I assume this is not a social call." "I have a massive, highly toxic problem living under my roof, Bradley," I replied, keeping my voice low and steady. "My son-in-law is running a sprawling, sophisticated Ponzi scheme. He is using my home address, my secure internet network, and offshore Caribbean shell accounts. I have reconstructed shredded documents proving he is actively stealing from private investors to fund a fraudulent tech startup. His runway has collapsed, and aggressive lenders are demanding immediate repayment. I need to sever my liability, and I need to do it before the authorities kick my front door down." There was a heavy, calculated silence on the other end of the line. I could practically hear Bradley's mind rapidly assessing the legal blast radius. "If his operation is based in your home, you are currently standing in the center of a federal target," Bradley finally stated. "We need to build an impenetrable firewall between your assets and his fraud immediately. Do not confront him. Do not let him know you suspect anything. I am bringing in Marcus Thorne. He is a top-tier private investigator who specializes in forensic accounting and cyber espionage for corporate espionage cases. We need to clone his hard drives and secure every digital fingerprint he has left in your house." "Derek rarely leaves his home office," I warned. "He is paranoid and fiercely guards his digital infrastructure." "Then you need to create a window of opportunity," Bradley countered smoothly. "Get him out of the house. Thorne and his team will handle the rest." The perfect opportunity presented itself the very next morning. It was Sunday, and Derek strode into the kitchen wearing a custom-tailored charcoal gray suit. Natalie trailed closely behind him in a vibrant designer dress. They were buzzing with an artificial manic energy. Derek proudly announced they were attending an exclusive high-profile networking brunch in the city. He claimed a major venture capitalist from Silicon Valley would be present, and this was their golden ticket to finally securing their massive funding round. It was a pathetic, transparent lie, but I smiled and wished them the best of luck. I stood by the large bay window and watched his silver sports car accelerate down the winding driveway. The moment they cleared the heavy wrought iron gates, I immediately sprang into action. I needed a flawless, undeniable cover story. If Derek happened to check the perimeter cameras from his phone, or if he returned early, he needed to see exactly what I wanted him to see. I walked down the long hallway toward the west wing of the estate, moving purposefully toward the secondary guest bathroom, located directly beneath Derek's office. I opened the vanity cabinet beneath the sink, grabbed a heavy wrench, and forcefully twisted the main water supply valve. I loosened the brass fitting just enough to create a rapid, steady leak. Within minutes, a large puddle of water spread across the expensive marble tiles, soaking into the adjacent hallway carpet. It was a controlled disaster, a perfectly orchestrated plumbing emergency. I pulled out my phone and sent a brief coded text message to the number Bradley had provided. 30 minutes later, 3 battered, unmarked white work vans pulled up to my front gates. I buzzed them in immediately. The vehicles parked haphazardly in the circular driveway, looking exactly like a disorganized crew of emergency contractors. 6 men stepped out of the vans. They wore dirty canvas work pants, heavy steel-toed boots, and faded blue shirts bearing the logo of a fictitious local plumbing company. Leading them was Marcus Thorne. He looked nothing like a highly trained cyber espionage expert. He looked like a rugged, exhausted foreman who had been pulling double shifts. But the heavy reinforced tool bags his men carried did not contain wrenches or pipe sealant. They were packed tight with military-grade forensic servers, hard drive cloning arrays, and signal interceptors. I met Thorne at the front door. We did not shake hands. He simply nodded and marched his team directly inside. I pointed toward the staircase leading to Derek's office. "He uses a biometric lock on the office door," I whispered, keeping my voice low despite the empty house. "And his primary desktop is heavily encrypted." "Not a problem," Thorne replied, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. My men can bypass a commercial biometric scanner in under 60 seconds. We will clone his primary drive, intercept his network router traffic, and mirror his cloud storage access tokens. We will be out of here in 2 hours. I watched in absolute silence as his team moved with terrifying practiced efficiency. 2 men stayed on the ground floor, loudly deploying heavy industrial wet vacuums and fans near the bathroom leak to maintain the perfect auditory illusion of emergency plumbing work. The rest of the team ascended the stairs. I stood at the top landing and watched Thorne approach Derek's heavily secured office door. He pulled a small black electronic device from his pocket, attached a thin wire to the biometric scanner, and tapped a few buttons. The heavy door clicked open in exactly 45 seconds. They swarmed into the room like a tactical strike team. They did not disturb a single piece of paper or move a single pen out of place. They connected thick black cables to Derek's sleek desktop computer, feeding the data directly into their portable humming servers. I stood in the doorway, watching the massive progress bars on their screens fill up rapidly. They were downloading his entire life. Every fraudulent email, every offshore bank transfer, every desperate message to his angry investors was being systematically captured, categorized, and secured. An hour into the operation, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a text from Bradley Pierce. He had arrived discreetly through the rear service entrance, completely avoiding the front cameras. I walked down the stairs to finally meet him. Bradley stood tall, looking entirely out of place in my quiet, casual kitchen. He wore a sharp navy suit that starkly contrasted with the chaotic scene unfolding in my kitchen. He did not offer a handshake or a pleasantry. He simply nodded toward the ceiling where the heavy industrial vacuums were roaring loudly. I explained the strict timeline we were operating under. He informed me that the cloning process was only the first phase of our counterattack. We needed eyes and ears inside the rooms where Derek felt the most secure. We needed to silently capture his phone calls, his hushed conversations with his offshore contacts, and his physical reactions to incoming threats. Thorne joined us in the kitchen, wiping imaginary sweat from his thick brow. He pulled a small velvet-lined case from his heavy canvas tool bag. Inside were 6 microscopic cameras, each no larger than the head of a small matchstick. He explained that these specific devices were wired directly into the electrical grid of the mansion, ensuring they would never run out of battery power. I directed 2 of his men into the main formal living room. They swiftly removed the ornate iron grates covering the large air conditioning return vents situated near the ceiling of the grand room. With surgical precision, they mounted the tiny lenses just behind the dark metal slats, rendering them completely invisible to the naked human eye. The sharp angle provided a perfect, unobstructed, high-definition view of the custom leather sofa, where Derek often sat to conduct his late-night international phone calls. Simultaneously, another highly trained technician was kneeling behind the large entertainment center. He was physically hardwiring a signal interceptor directly into the main fiber optic line that fed the entire mansion. This would seamlessly allow us to capture every single packet of unencrypted data transmitting through his wireless network router. Upstairs, Thorne personally handled Derek's private executive office. I followed him into the warm, claustrophobic room. He carefully unscrewed the brass ventilation cover located directly above Derek's massive oak desk. He mounted 2 separate high-definition cameras. One was specifically angled to capture a clear view of the computer monitor and the keyboard. The second camera was perfectly positioned to capture Derek's face and the surrounding room. Thorne also installed a highly sensitive audio transmitter beneath the solid wood desk, attaching it firmly with a heavy industrial adhesive. It would easily pick up a soft whisper from 20 feet away. While the physical bugs were being meticulously placed, the digital extraction was reaching its critical final stage. The lead technician sitting on the floor was rapidly typing lines of green code into a rugged military-grade laptop. He was creating a perfect functioning clone of Derek's primary wireless network. Every single password, every secure login token, and every encrypted email draft was being silently siphoned into our highly encrypted servers. I watched the progress bar slowly inch toward 99%. The sheer amount of data this man possessed was absolutely staggering, and now it was entirely legally, rightfully ours. We were exactly 15 minutes ahead of schedule. The covert operation was proceeding flawlessly. The massive house was successfully bugged, the critical data was secured, and the fake plumbing leak was slowly being cleaned up by the remaining crew members. I felt a rare surge of profound, victorious satisfaction. But then the heavy, unmistakable sound of a high-performance engine roared down the long driveway. My blood instantly turned to freezing ice. I rushed to the front window and peered through the thick curtains. Derek's silver sports car was aggressively pulling up to the grand front entrance of the mansion. They were back an entire hour early. My heart slammed against my ribs with terrifying bruising force. If Derek walked into his office right now, he would see 3 strange men in dirty work clothes copying his hard drives. He would see the open air vents and the exposed electrical wires. The entire counterattack would be instantly destroyed, and the resulting legal fallout would be absolute and catastrophic. I spun around and looked directly at Bradley. His cold, calculating eyes widened for a fraction of a second. I held up my hand, demanding absolute silence from the men standing nearby. "He is here," I hissed urgently, keeping my voice incredibly low. "Get the equipment packed up right now. Use the rear service stairs and exit through the back patio doors. You have exactly 2 minutes to disappear." Thorne did not ask a single unnecessary question. He simply raised 2 fingers silently, signaling his highly trained team to instantly initiate an emergency extraction protocol. They moved with terrifying speed, violently yanking cables and closing heavy tool bags. I took a deep, steadying breath, forced a pleasant, relaxed smile onto my rigid face, and walked purposefully toward the massive front foyer area. I needed to intercept my incoming son-in-law immediately. The heavy front doors swung open with a loud, echoing creak. Derek stepped inside, looking flushed and visibly irritated. Natalie was nowhere to be seen, likely dropped off at an expensive boutique downtown. He carried his leather briefcase tightly against his chest, his eyes fixed firmly on the grand staircase leading directly up to his private office. He took 2 fast, aggressive steps forward. I immediately stepped squarely into his direct path, physically blocking the bottom of the carpeted stairs with my body holding a glass of ice-cold water. I portrayed the perfect image of a calm, entirely unbothered and bored retired father. "Derek," I said, my voice projecting a loud, cheerful boom that echoed sharply off the marble walls, serving as an auditory warning to the men frantically packing up upstairs. "You are home remarkably early. I thought this crucial networking brunch was supposed to last until at least 3:00. Did you manage to secure that elusive venture capital funding you so desperately need?" Derek stopped abruptly, clearly annoyed by my physical presence blocking his direct path. He shifted his heavy briefcase to his left hand. He offered a tight, incredibly forced, and thoroughly fake smile. "The primary target investor had to cancel at the absolute last minute due to a family emergency," Derek replied smoothly, lying without a single trace of hesitation or guilt. "I decided it was a poor use of my valuable time to mingle with low-level associates. I need to get back to my office right now, Dad. I have several critical international conference calls to initiate." He stepped to the left, attempting to casually maneuver around me. I immediately mirrored his movement, stepping to the left as well, planting firmly. My feet stood firmly on the bottom wooden stair. "It is a beautiful Sunday afternoon, Derek." I continued, speaking slowly and deliberately, listening intensely for the faint sound of the back patio door opening. "You are working yourself into an early tragic grave. You need to learn how to properly compartmentalize your intense stress. We should go out to the country club right now and play a quick 9 holes of golf. The fresh air and the physical exertion would do incredible wonders for your mental state. I know your short game has been suffering tremendously lately. I could help." The evening air hung heavy, saturated with the scent of roasted rosemary and expensive, over-reduced balsamic glaze. Derek had transformed the formal dining room into a stage for his final act. Soft candlelight flickered against the crystal stemware, and the gentle melody of a jazz piano played in the background, carefully curated to soothe the senses. I sat at the head of the table nursing a glass of the same vintage Bordeaux he had foolishly splurged on. Opposite me, Derek and Natalie mirrored the posture of a loving, concerned, and desperate couple. They were leaning into their roles, their faces etched with the precise amount of professional sorrow required to soften a hardened heart. Derek placed his fork down with a deliberate, soft clatter. He looked at me, his eyes rimmed with a faint, artificial redness that I knew he had practiced in the bathroom mirror. He took a shaky, uneven breath, the hallmark of his ongoing performance. "Dad, I have to be completely honest with you." He started, his voice barely rising above the low hum of the jazz. "The networking brunch went as well as it could, but the news from the venture capital side is grim. Our lead investor, the one who was supposed to finalize our Series B round, withdrew his commitment 3 hours ago. He cited market volatility, but we both know he got cold feet because of the current tech sector downturn. We are staring into the abyss, Harrison. If I do not secure a capital injection by Monday morning, I will be forced to liquidate the company and lay off 40 brilliant engineers who have families to feed. It is a disaster." He paused, letting the silence thicken, allowing the weight of his fabricated failure to press down on me. I nodded slowly, maintaining a mask of grandfatherly concern. I watched Natalie reach across the linen tablecloth. She took my hand in hers, her skin soft and unnervingly cold. Her eyes searched mine, flickering with a calculated intensity. "We feel so ashamed asking you this, Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling just enough to be effective. "We know you have already been so patient with our transition. But we are a family. We stand together through the good and the incredibly dark. I keep thinking about Mom. I keep thinking about how Diana always handled crises with such grace, such unyielding loyalty. She would never have let us drown, would she? She would want you to be the rock for us right now to help us weather this one final terrifying storm until the market stabilizes." The mention of Diana felt like a physical blow to my chest. It was a vile tactical strike. They were weaponizing the memory of a woman they had barely known, dragging her ghost into this sordid web of fraud and desperation. I felt a surge of nausea, but I kept my hand steady beneath Natalie's touch. I offered a sad, distant smile, the kind that might pass for a man lost in a bittersweet memory. "Diana was always the heart of this family," I said, my voice thick with a fake, forced nostalgia. "She believed in second chances. She believed in the potential of people she loved." Derek seized the momentum, sensing the slightest crack in my armor. He stood up and pulled a thick leather folio from his chair. "I have drafted a home equity line of credit, Dad. Just a temporary measure. $2 million collateralized against the equity of this mansion. It is a bridge loan purely to maintain our burn rate until the new investors sign on. The moment the new capital hits our account, the line will be paid off in full. You will not even notice the debt on the property. It is just a pen stroke on a piece of paper, a simple act of faith in our future." He pushed the folder toward me. The document was a masterpiece of legal deception, a $2 million anchor they intended to tie around my neck to drag me into their sinking ship. They were so close. They could practically smell the cash, feel the rush of the credit hitting their illicit accounts. I looked at the folder, then back at them. I kept my face illuminated by the warm, forgiving glow of the candles. I looked at Derek, the failed entrepreneur, and Natalie, the architect of my emotional manipulation. I looked at them and felt a profound, exhilarating sense of triumph. They were so consumed by their own greed that they were completely blind to the fact that I had already stripped away their safety net. "You are right, Derek," I said, my voice clear and unwavering, cutting through the jazz music. "We are a family, and families do have to look out for each other in the darkest hours." Derek's face transformed, his desperation giving way to a sickening, hungry relief. His fingers twitched, ready to grab the folio the moment I signaled my intent. Natalie smiled, a wide, triumphant expression that almost looked genuine. They really thought they had won. They truly believed I was the broken, sentimental old man they had played for fools. "I will sign this," I continued patting the folder gently. "But these papers require a specific type of notarization for an amount of this magnitude. I have my own legal counsel, Bradley, who handles all my private estate transfers. It would be entirely irresponsible of me to sign a document that has not been properly vetted by my own eyes and my own trusted team." I stood up, leaving the folder exactly where it was. I walked over to the sideboard and poured myself a final small glass of wine. I turned back to them, my smile wide and warm. "Print the final papers, son. Have them ready for me by Tuesday. I will review them thoroughly over the weekend, and we will sit down and sign them next week. It will be the most important signature I give, and it deserves the proper amount of care and attention. Do not worry. Your crisis is officially over." Derek looked startled by the delay, but the greed was too deep to let him retreat. He nodded, trying to hide the frantic impatience that had begun to color his cheeks. "Tuesday, Dad. Tuesday is perfect. I will have the printer ready." I walked toward the doorway, pausing just for a second to look back at them. They looked like two hungry scavengers huddled over a carcass that was far from dead. I had set the trap with surgical precision. By the time Tuesday arrived, they would not be worried about bank loans or startup funding. They would be fighting to stay out of a federal prison. I left them in the dining room, descending into the cool, silent darkness of the hallway. The game was mine. The end was already written. Wednesday morning arrived with a heavy, oppressive sky. The air outside was thick with impending rain, a fitting atmosphere for the storm that was about to break inside my private study. I sat behind my desk, the massive oak surface cleared of everything except a single cup of black coffee. At precisely 9 o'clock, a discreet knock sounded at the rear service door. I bypassed the main house security and let them in myself. Bradley Pierce stepped into the hallway, first his usual sharp suit replaced by a muted charcoal blazer. Marcus Thorne followed closely behind him. The private investigator did not look like a man who had slept in the last 48 hours. He carried a thick, heavy black briefcase locked with a biometric thumbprint scanner. We walked to my study in absolute silence. I shut the heavy double doors and engaged the deadbolt. Thorne placed the briefcase on my desk, pressed his thumb against the glowing green sensor, and popped the latches. He extracted a massive, perfectly bound dossier. It was at least 4 inches thick, a mountain of undeniable digital evidence meticulously translated into damning physical proof. Bradley took a seat opposite my desk, his face a mask of cold, professional grimness. He did not offer any pleasantries. He did not ask how my weekend was. He simply pointed a manicured finger directly at the thick stack of paper. The trap we had set over dinner was about to close, but first, I needed to understand the exact anatomy of the monster living under my roof. Thorne remained standing, pacing slowly across the Persian rug like a caged predator. He cleared his throat, his voice rough and deeply serious. "The data extraction from Sunday was a complete and total success, Harrison," he began. He leaned over the desk and flipped open the heavy cover of the dossier. The first page was a complex, highly detailed flowchart. It showed a tangled web of shell companies, dummy corporations, and offshore holding accounts. I looked at the names printed in bold black ink. They were variations of tech jargon, meaningless buzzwords designed to sound legitimate. Thorne tapped the center of the chart with a heavy finger. "Derek does not have a software company, Harrison. He does not employ engineers. He does not have a single piece of proprietary technology. His entire operation is a textbook, highly sophisticated Ponzi scheme." He paused to let the harsh reality of those words settle into the quiet room. "He explicitly targets a very specific demographic. Elderly high-net-worth individuals looking for aggressive returns on their retirement portfolios. He attends wealthy country clubs, charity galas, and high-end golf tournaments. He sells them the illusion of getting in on the ground floor of the next revolutionary Silicon Valley giant. He takes their massive cash deposits and immediately funnels the money through a labyrinth of Caribbean banks." Bradley leaned forward, picking up the narrative with clinical precision. "It is a classic robbing Peter to pay Paul scenario. When the early investors demand to see their promised dividends, Derek simply uses the fresh capital stolen from the newest victims to pay them off. He keeps the illusion of profitability alive while systematically siphoning off a massive percentage for himself. That is how he affords the $80,000 platinum watches, the custom suits, and the vintage wine collections. He is burning through millions of dollars of stolen retirement funds to play the role of a successful tech visionary. He is a predator feeding on the vulnerable. I stared at the flowchart, a cold sickness settling deep in my stomach. The sheer terrifying scale of his deliberate financial deception was incredibly staggering. I had built my heavy machinery business through decades of honest, back-breaking labor. I knew the value of a dollar earned through sweat and sacrifice. I had spent countless long, difficult nights awake worrying about paying my own hard-working employees on time. To see this arrogant, entitled boy casually destroy the life savings of good, innocent people was completely abhorrent. But the grim expression on Thorne's exhausted face told me the story was far from over. The worst was yet to come. Thorne flipped the dossier to a section marked with a bright red tab. The problem with a Ponzi scheme is that it requires a constant, never-ending supply of fresh victims to survive. Thorne explained, his voice dropping to a low, ominous register. 2 months ago, the well dried up. The tech market cooled, and Derek could not find any new marks willing to write massive checks. His entire house of cards began to collapse rapidly. The older investors started demanding their principal back, threatening massive lawsuits and federal investigations. So Derek made a fatal, utterly catastrophic decision. He went off the books. Bradley crossed his arms, his jaw clenched incredibly tight. He did not go to a traditional bank for a bridge loan, Harrison. Banks require collateral audits and transparency. Derek went to unregulated, highly dangerous private lenders. He borrowed heavily from a syndicate operating in the shadows of the financial district. We are talking about ruthless, violent men who do not file civil lawsuits when they are owed money. They specialize in aggressive debt collection. They operate entirely outside the boundaries of the law. Derek borrowed $4 million from these criminals, promising them exorbitant interest rates he could never realistically repay. The freezing wave of realization washed over me entirely. The funding crisis Derek sobbed about on my porch was not about a venture capitalist pulling out. It was about a $4 million debt owed to violent criminals. The missing angel investor from dinner was just another fabricated lie to cover up his need to access the equity in my home. He needed my $2 million line of credit to pay off the mob. Thorne pushed a final document across the smooth oak desk. It was a copy of the illicit loan agreement Derek had signed with the syndicate. My eyes scanned the page and immediately locked onto a specific, terrifying paragraph. To secure the $4 million, Derek had to provide proof of substantial assets. He listed his primary residence as collateral. He listed my address. He submitted forged utility bills and altered property tax records to convince these violent men that he was the sole legal owner of this estate. My lungs felt incredibly tight. The air in the study suddenly became painfully thin. The danger was no longer confined to digital bank accounts or angry retirees. The danger was physical, and it was pointed directly at my front door. If Derek failed to deliver their money by Monday, these ruthless men would not serve an eviction notice. They would come to seize the asset Derek had fraudulently promised them. They would inevitably come directly to my home. They would tear down the heavy iron gates and shatter the sanctuary I had built with my late wife. Derek had willingly tied a violent criminal anchor directly to my life. I slowly closed the heavy dossier and looked at Bradley. The trap was set, but the stakes were now a matter of life and death. I remained alone in the chilling silence of my study after Bradley and Thorne departed. The revelation of the violent syndicate hung over my home like a suffocating shroud. I did not sleep. I could not sleep. I spent the remainder of the weekend acting the part of the blissfully ignorant father, sharing polite meals with Derek and Natalie, listening to their fake laughter and counting down the agonizing hours. Sunday night finally draped the estate in absolute darkness. I retreated to my master bedroom, locking the heavy door securely behind me. I did not turn on a single lamp. The only light in the expansive room emanated from the crisp, high-definition screen of my encrypted tablet resting on my lap. I opened the secure application Thorne had installed, connecting directly to the microscopic cameras hidden deep within the air vents of Derek's office. The digital clock on my screen read exactly 1:15 in the morning. The feed showed Derek's office bathed in the harsh artificial glow of his desk lamp. I waited with the practiced patience of a hunter in a blind. At 1:30, the office door slowly creaked open. Derek slipped inside, closing the door behind him, with exaggerated care ensuring the latch barely made a sound. He looked absolutely dreadful. The smug, confident entrepreneur, who had calmly asked for a $2 million lifeline over roasted rosemary dinner, was completely gone. His face was a pale, sickly gray, covered in a thick sheen of nervous sweat. He wore rumpled sweatpants and a stained t-shirt, his hands trembling visibly as he approached the heavy oak desk. He looked like a cornered animal frantically checking his phone every few seconds, likely anticipating another aggressive, threatening message from the violent lenders who held his life in their hands. He sat down heavily in his ergonomic chair, wiping a trembling hand across his damp forehead. He reached down and opened his heavy leather briefcase, the very same one he had dropped on the porch days ago. He did not pull out a simple stack of blank home equity line of credit documents to prepare for our supposed Tuesday meeting. Instead, he carefully extracted a flat, rectangular device. It was a high-intensity, ultra-thin LED light box. He plugged it in, and a blinding white square illuminated his frantic face. My chest tightened as I watched him pull a manila folder from the bottom of the briefcase. He opened it and carefully laid out a document I immediately recognized. It was the original deed to the guest house, a document that bore my clear, authentic, and legally binding signature. I watched through the hidden lens as the ultimate depth of his betrayal unfolded before my eyes. Derek placed my authentic signature directly onto the glowing white surface of the lightbox. He then took the final signature page of the massive $2 million loan agreement and placed it meticulously over the top. The bright light pierced through the heavy paper, making my signature perfectly visible from beneath. He picked up a thick blue ink pen, took a ragged, shallow breath, and leaned over the desk. He was not just stealing my money. He was stealing my identity. He was aggressively forging my name to secure a loan that would permanently attach a violent criminal syndicate directly to my property. He had never possessed the slightest intention of waiting for our Tuesday meeting. He knew I would read the fine print. He knew I would involve Bradley. He knew the entire elaborate scheme would instantly collapse under any genuine legal scrutiny. His hand shook violently as the pen hovered over the paper. He stopped, squeezed his eyes shut, and slapped his own face hard, trying to force his frayed nerves under control. He gripped his right wrist with his left hand to steady the tremors. Then, with agonizing slowness, he began to trace. He moved the pen with meticulous, desperate precision, perfectly mimicking the sharp loops and sharp angles of my personal signature. The microphone hidden beneath the desk captured the scratchy, rhythmic sound of the pen tearing against the thick paper. He was forging the document that would grant him immediate access to $2 million of my hard-earned equity. He planned to submit this falsified paperwork to the bank the moment their doors opened on Monday morning, hoping the massive funds would clear before I ever suspected a single thing. He was effectively selling my home to the mob to save his own pathetic life. The sheer brazen audacity of the act burned through my veins like liquid fire. My breathing remained slow and measured in the dark silence of my bedroom, but a cold, absolute fury settled deep within my bones. This was no longer just a financial dispute or a case of extreme familial entitlement. This was a severe, undeniable federal crime unfolding in high-definition video. I tapped the screen of my tablet, ensuring the encrypted recording software was capturing every single frame, every drop of sweat, and every scratch of the blue pen. I zoomed the camera feed in slightly, obtaining a perfectly clear, unobstructed view of his hands, completing the intricate forgery. He lifted the pen, turned off the bright lightbox, and held the forged document up to the desk lamp. He scrutinized it with the critical eye of a desperate criminal, comparing it side by side with the original deed. A sickening wave of relief washed over his pale face. He let out a long, shuddering breath, dropping his head back against the chair. He believed he had done it. He believed he had successfully stolen his salvation. He quickly gathered the documents, slipping the forged loan agreement into a pristine red folder ready for the bank. He packed away the lightbox, cleaned his workspace to maintain the illusion of a dedicated executive, and quietly slipped out of the office, turning off the desk lamp and plunging the room back into total darkness. The live feed went black save for the faint glow filtering through his window. I lowered the tablet, letting the heavy silence of the master bedroom wrap around me. I had just witnessed the absolute point of no return. Derek had dug his own grave with a blue ink pen, and I now possessed the exact shovel needed to bury him permanently. The trap was no longer just a theory. It was a steel cage, and he had just willingly locked himself inside. I placed the tablet on my nightstand, my mind operating with the cold, ruthless efficiency of a man preparing for absolute warfare. Tomorrow morning he would attempt to execute his grand, fraudulent escape. He would try to trade my life's work for his freedom. But I would be waiting. I closed my eyes not to sleep, but to visualize the precise, devastating sequence of events that would unfold at dawn. The clueless old man was dead. I sat in the darkness of my bedroom, my eyes locked on the screen of the tablet. Derek had just turned off his desk lamp, plunging the office into shadows. I believed the performance was over for the night. I believed the forgery was the deepest cut I would have to endure. But the live feed suddenly registered a shift in the light. The door of the office drifted open. A silhouette stepped into the room, illuminated by moonlight. It was Natalie, my daughter, my only child. She was wearing a silk robe, her hair tied back. She walked up behind Derek, who had slumped back into his chair in a state of relief. My heart caught in my throat. A flicker of hope ignited. I wanted her to look down at the desk. I wanted her to see the lightbox, the forged documents, and the evidence of her husband's crimes. I prayed that she would react with the integrity that her mother had possessed. I wanted my daughter to demand answers, to rip the papers to shreds, and to prove she was a victim of Derek's manipulation. I held my breath, waiting. Instead, Natalie moved with a practiced calmness. She did not gasp. She did not ask a single question. She walked over to the small, wet bar. The hidden microphone picked up the clink of glass. She poured a measure of my scotch. She carried the tumbler and handed it to Derek. He took it with trembling fingers, offering her a smile of gratitude. She stood behind his chair and began to massage his shoulders. The domesticity of the scene made my stomach churn. She was not oblivious. "Is it perfectly done?" Natalie asked, her voice smooth, remarkably low, and entirely devoid of any moral conflict. "It is done," Derek replied, taking a long, desperate swallow of the amber liquid. "The signature is a flawless, undeniable match. I will submit the line of credit paperwork to the bank the very moment the doors open tomorrow morning. We should easily have the $2 million transferred by Wednesday afternoon. The syndicate will finally be paid, and we can breathe." Natalie leaned forward, her face hovering mere inches from the hidden camera lens. The caring daughter who had tearfully invoked her dead mother's memory was gone. In her place was a cold, calculating stranger with hollow eyes and a sharp, ruthless ambition. "Make sure the signature is flawless, Derek," Natalie instructed, her tone pragmatic. "The bank cannot have a single reason to delay the funds. We have a very strict timeline to follow, and the next phase requires absolute precision." Derek nodded slowly, staring blankly at the dark computer monitor. "Are you absolutely certain about the medical side of this plan, Natalie? If another doctor challenges the diagnosis, the entire legal strategy will instantly disintegrate." "It will not be challenged," my daughter stated with supreme confidence. My friend Jessica has a private psychiatrist on her payroll. He has already agreed to sign the medical evaluation stating that Dad is suffering from severe dementia. The paperwork will document cognitive decline, paranoia, and a total inability to manage his affairs. I sat completely frozen on the edge of my bed. The words echoed through the tiny speaker of my tablet, striking me with the physical force of a heavy sledgehammer. Severe dementia. Cognitive decline. They were not just stealing my hard-earned money. They were actively conspiring to steal my mind, my freedom, and my basic human dignity. Natalie picked up the empty crystal glass from the desk, her voice taking on an upbeat cadence. Once the $2 million loan clears and the syndicate is off our backs, we immediately file the medical evaluation with the probate court. We petition for an involuntary conservatorship. The judge will grant it within 48 hours based on the fabricated assessment. We will have control over his estate, his investment portfolios, and this property. Derek looked up at her, a glimmer of awe, mixing seamlessly with his lingering fear. And what exactly do we do with him? He cannot possibly stay here if we assume full legal control. He will fight us every single step of the way. He will not be able to fight us. Natalie replied, a cruel, mocking smile playing on her lips. Because he will not be here. Once the conservatorship is granted, we are transferring him to that state-run care facility upstate. It is cheap secured and they restrict outside communication. He will be out of our way. We can finally sell this mansion, liquidate the company, and move to Silicon Valley. The audio feed hissed with static, but the sheer malice in her words rang with absolute crystal clarity. My own flesh and blood. The child I had rocked to sleep, the daughter I had carried proudly on my shoulders, had just calmly outlined a meticulous plan to effectively bury me alive. She was actively designing a living funeral. She intended to lock me away in a dismal, forgotten facility, completely strip me of my rights, and feast on the remains of my life's work. Tears of grief sprang to my eyes. They were born from the death of the father and daughter I thought I knew. I let them fall in the darkness. I mourned for the little girl who used to paint me pictures. But as the tears tracked down my cheeks, a transformation occurred within my soul. The sorrow did not last. The tears of betrayal instantly froze into ice. I wiped my face. The slight trembling in my fingers had completely vanished. My breathing slowed, becoming deep, rhythmic, and incredibly steady. The initial shock was entirely gone rapidly, replaced by a terrifying, absolute clarity. Natalie had just crossed a fatal boundary that could never be uncrossed. She had foolishly assumed my age equated to weakness. She believed my love for her would render me permanently blind and defenseless. She had gravely misunderstood the fundamental nature of the man who built an empire from dirt. I watched them embrace on the small digital screen, happily celebrating their vile, impending victory. They genuinely believed they had outsmarted an old, tired dinosaur. They had absolutely no idea they were dancing on a stage I had already wired with heavy explosives. I slowly reached out and tapped the glowing red button on the tablet, permanently saving the encrypted video file to a secure remote server. I did not need to hear another single word. The emotional ties that had tethered me to these two people were permanently severed. I stood up in the dark, my aging body feeling remarkably lighter, much stronger, and infinitely more dangerous than it had in 3 decades. Tomorrow morning, Derek would walk into a local bank with a forged document. He would knowingly trigger the catastrophic avalanche, and I would be standing safely on the high ridge, entirely ready to watch them both get buried under the immense, crushing weight of their own criminal greed. The time for sorrow was finally over. The time for absolute annihilation had begun. I did not sleep a single minute for the rest of that night. I remained sitting in the dark of my master bedroom, watching the faint glow of the moon shift slowly across the hardwood floor. The profound, suffocating grief that had initially paralyzed my chest was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, mechanical focus. Natalie had explicitly outlined her intention to erase me from my own life, to strip away my freedom and lock me in a sterile state-run facility. She had declared war, and she had done it with a casual, chilling indifference. I showered before dawn, letting the freezing water shock my nervous system into absolute alertness. I dressed in my sharpest, darkest suit, the armor I had worn to negotiate my most brutal corporate acquisitions. The clueless old man was dead. It was time to introduce my daughter and her parasitic husband to the ruthless predator who had actually built this empire. I left the estate at 5 a.m, driving through the quiet fog-drenched streets of the city. I arrived at Bradley Pierce's private law office at exactly 6:00 The heavy glass doors were already unlocked. Bradley was waiting for me in his expansive boardroom, nursing a cup of black coffee. He took one look at my face and immediately set the porcelain cup down. I did not bother with pleasantries. I placed my encrypted tablet squarely in the center of the polished mahogany table and played the intercepted video feed from Derek's office. I watched Bradley's eyes narrow as he witnessed the meticulous forgery. I watched his jaw tighten as he listened to Natalie calmly detail the bribed psychiatrist, the fabricated dementia diagnosis, and the involuntary conservatorship. When the video concluded, Bradley leaned back in his leather chair, exhaling a long, steady breath. He had navigated vicious corporate betrayals for decades, but the sheer intimate malice of this plot clearly disturbed him. "They have weaponized the legal system against you, Harrison," Bradley stated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "A forged home equity line of credit is a severe federal crime, but the medical conservatorship is a terrifyingly effective strategy. If they manage to file that fabricated psychiatric evaluation with a sympathetic judge before we act, they could temporarily freeze your assets and physically remove you from your home. We are no longer playing defense. We need to strike the earth from beneath their feet." "I want them to inherit dust, Bradley," I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "I want to vaporize every single asset they think they are going to steal. When Derek submits that forged loan application to the bank, I want it to hit a solid brick wall. And when Natalie attempts to seize my estate, I want her to find absolutely nothing but empty air." Bradley nodded, his fingers dancing rapidly across his laptop keyboard. "We initiate a lightning transfer. As of this exact second, we are completely liquidating your accessible personal bank accounts, your liquid stock portfolios, and your private investment funds. We are moving every single penny into a deeply fortified, impenetrable, irrevocable trust. By legally transferring ownership of your wealth from you as an individual to the trust entity, you effectively cease to own those assets. If a judge grants Natalie a conservatorship over Harrison, she will only gain control over a man who is on paper entirely penniless. She cannot touch the trust. It is a financial fortress." For the next 2 hours, the boardroom became a frantic, high-stakes command center. I signed dozens of complex legal documents authorizing the immediate transfer of $30 million in liquid capital. I watched the balances on my personal accounts drop to zero, siphoned away into a secure, heavily guarded legal structure that neither Derek nor Natalie could ever hope to breach. But the cash was only one half of the battle. The most immediate physical threat was the $3 million estate. Derek had used the property as collateral to appease a violent criminal syndicate. If the mob came looking to collect their $4 million debt, they would aggressively target the mansion, completely indifferent to who was currently holding the deed. "The house is the anchor," I told Bradley, staring at the growing stack of signed transfer documents. "Derek forged my signature to leverage the equity. He needs that $2 million bank loan to clear by Wednesday to pay off his dangerous private lenders. If the bank discovers the property is no longer mine, the loan is instantly denied. Derek defaults on the mob, and the syndicate comes crashing down on his head. You cannot simply transfer the mansion into the trust," Bradley cautioned, tapping a silver pen against his desk. A transfer of a primary residence into a newly formed trust could raise red flags with the bank during their preliminary underwriting review. They might view it as a fraudulent conveyance. You need to execute a clean, verifiable, and absolute sale of the property. But doing that on the open market takes months. We need it done today. Then we do an off-market sale, I countered, pulling out my phone. I am calling Elias Vance. He runs a massive privately held real estate acquisition firm based out of Chicago. We have done extensive business together for 20 years. He possesses the liquid capital to purchase the estate outright, and he has the aggressive legal team required to push the closing paperwork through the county clerk's office before noon. I dialed Elias's private number. I gave him a brief, heavily sanitized version of the situation, explaining that I needed to immediately liquidate my primary residence for strategic tax purposes. Elias did not ask probing, unnecessary questions. He understood the urgent nature of corporate maneuvering. He agreed to purchase the mansion for exactly $3 million in cash, wiring the funds directly into my newly established, irrevocable trust. There is one final crucial condition, Elias, I added, glancing at Bradley, who was already drafting the emergency purchase agreement. I need a 30-day leaseback clause woven into the final contract. I am selling you the house today, but I am legally renting it back from your holding company for the next month. I need the physical illusion that nothing has changed. Derek and Natalie must believe I am still the owner until the trap completely snaps shut on their necks. Elias agreed to the terms instantly. The gears of our rapid counterattack engaged with flawless, devastating efficiency. By 10 o'clock in the morning, the heavy, imposing mansion that I had meticulously restored with Diana no longer belonged to me. The title was legally transferred to a nameless, faceless corporate holding entity located halfway across the country. The substantial sale proceeds were securely locked away inside the irrevocable trust. I stood by the vast floor-to-ceiling windows of Bradley's office, looking out over the bustling city below. I was officially a ghost in the financial system. I owned no bank accounts, no stock portfolios, and no real estate. The stage was finally set for their total destruction. I was ready. I smiled. It officially began. The morning sun felt entirely different as I walked through the grand foyer of the estate. It was Tuesday, the day my son-in-law believed he would finally secure his fraudulent salvation. I moved through the quiet house with a profound sense of detachment. The imported marble floors, the heavy crystal chandeliers, and the sprawling manicured lawns outside no longer belonged to me. The off-market sale to Elias Vance had been fully executed and officially recorded. My immense liquid wealth was safely locked behind the impenetrable steel walls of an irrevocable trust. Legally speaking, I was a ghost occupying a space I no longer owned. The psychological freedom was absolutely intoxicating. I walked into my private study, leaving the heavy double doors wide open, and waited for the final performance to begin. At exactly 9:15, Derek strode into the room. He wore a pristine, tailored navy suit, but the aggressive confidence he usually projected was fraying severely at the edges. His face was pale, and a fine layer of nervous sweat glistened on his forehead. The violent syndicate's deadline was rapidly approaching, and the pressure was visibly crushing him. He clutched a sleek leather folder tightly against his chest, treating it like a fragile palm. He forced a wide, incredibly strained smile onto his face as he approached my desk. "Good morning, Dad," Derek said, his voice pitched slightly higher than usual. "I hope you had a restful evening. As we discussed over our lovely dinner on Sunday, I have the preliminary home equity line of credit documents prepared for your signature. It is a simple administrative formality just to get the bank's underwriting process initiated so we can bridge this minor funding gap." He placed the open folder directly in front of me, smoothing the thick legal pages with a trembling hand. I looked down at the documents. They were the exact same pages I had watched him meticulously forge on his glowing lightbox just 48 hours prior. He needed my authentic witnessed signature on these supposed drafts to maintain the desperate illusion that I was a willing participant in his scheme. It was a calculated performance designed to keep me docile and compliant while he took his flawless forgery directly to the bank executives. I reached for my reading glasses with a slow, deliberately clumsy motion. I let my hands shake visibly as I placed the frames on my face, squinting hard at the dense paragraphs of financial text. Natalie had confidently assured him that I was suffering from severe cognitive decline. It was time to feed their vicious narrative. There are so many pages here, Derek, I mumbled, letting my voice drift into a hazy, uncertain register. I do not understand all these massive numbers and banking terms. Are you entirely sure this will not interfere with my monthly pension deposits? Diana usually handled the complicated property taxes. My mind feels incredibly foggy this morning. I am finding it very difficult to concentrate on this. Derek leaned over the desk, his eyes darting frantically between my face and the signature line. Do not worry about the complex fine print, Dad. I have had my own legal team review every single clause. It is completely standard and absolutely safe. The bank simply needs your signature on the bottom line to process the background checks. You are protecting our family's future right now. We are so incredibly grateful for your sharp business sense. I picked up the heavy gold fountain pen resting on my desk. I held it awkwardly, letting the nib hover unsteadily over the thick paper. I looked up at Derek, blinking slowly, projecting an image of total, pathetic vulnerability. What exact day is it today, son? I asked, slurring my words slightly. Is it Thursday? I believe I have a golf game scheduled with Bradley this afternoon. I really should not sign anything important before I play a full 18 holes of golf. Derek exhaled a sharp, jagged breath. His polished mask cracked, revealing the raw, frantic panic underneath. He gripped the edge of my oak desk so hard his knuckles turned stark white. It is Tuesday, Dad. It is Tuesday morning. Please, I just need you to sign the paper right now. I have a critical, unmovable appointment with the bank manager in exactly 30 minutes. I nodded slowly, letting out a long, weary sigh. I pressed the gold nib to the paper, but I did not write my actual legally binding signature. Instead, I gripped the pen tightly and slowly dragged the ink across the page in a sloppy, disjointed scrawl. I intentionally misspelled my own last name, leaving out a letter and transforming the elegant cursive into a chaotic, jagged mess. It was a completely invalid, atrocious signature that no financial institution on earth would ever legally accept. Derek eagerly snatched the folder off the desk. The absolute second the pen lifted from the page, he glanced down at the signature line and instantly froze. His jaw clenched with such sudden violence I could hear his teeth grind. He stared at the ruined, misspelled signature, a flash of pure, unadulterated fury washing over his pale face. He had asked for my signature, and I had given him the pathetic scribbling of a severely declining mind. For a terrifying second, I thought he might explode. I watched his chest heave as he fought the urge to scream, to demand that I sign a fresh copy properly. But then the cold reality of his own criminal backup plan asserted itself. He did not actually need my real signature on this specific draft. He already possessed the flawless, highly illegal forgery he had painstakingly created in the dark. This ruined document was merely a prop to keep me sedated. He forced his features back into a rigid, painful smile. Thank you, Dad, Derek said, his voice tight and incredibly strained. This is perfectly fine for the preliminary drafts. I will take these straight down to the bank and handle all the complicated administrative work myself. You just rest here and enjoy your quiet Tuesday. I will see you tonight for dinner. He turned sharply on his heel and marched rapidly out of the study. I listened to his aggressive footsteps echoing down the marble hallway. The heavy front door slammed shut, followed instantly by the loud roaring acceleration of his sports car tearing down the long driveway. He was racing toward the bank, entirely convinced he had successfully manipulated a broken, senile old man. The moment the sound of his engine faded into the distance, my entire demeanor shifted instantly. The trembling in my hands vanished completely. The hazy confusion evaporated from my eyes, replaced by cold, hard steel. I reached into the deep bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a secondary identical folder. It contained the high-definition photographs Thorne's hidden cameras had captured of Derek, meticulously tracing my signature on the lightbox. It also contained a clear, unaltered audio recording of Derek and Natalie discussing the forged documents and the fake dementia diagnosis. I picked up my secure phone and dialed Bradley Pierce. He answered immediately, the background noise indicating he was already outside and moving. The bait has been successfully taken, I stated, my voice sharp and commanding. Derek just left the estate. He is heading directly to the primary downtown branch of our bank. He accepted a deliberately botched signature from me without demanding a single correction, which confirms beyond any shadow of a doubt that he intends to use the forged documents he created on Sunday night. Perfect, Bradley replied, his tone radiating a dark, lethal satisfaction. I am standing outside the local field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation right now. I have Marcus Thorne with me, and we are holding the complete digital dossier. We have the intercepted network traffic, the offshore routing numbers, the threatening messages from the criminal syndicate, and the crystal-clear video of the forgery. Give them everything, Bradley, I commanded, staring out the window at the heavy iron gates. Make sure the lead federal agent understands that Derek is currently walking into a federally insured bank with the explicit intent to commit massive wire fraud and identity theft. The crime is no longer a theoretical plan. It is actively in motion. The agents have been briefed on the preliminary data, Harrison, Bradley assured me. They are highly motivated. The moment Derek hands those forged loan documents to the bank manager and formally requests the $2 million transfer, he crosses the absolute legal threshold. The FBI Financial Crimes Unit is already monitoring the bank's internal network. They are waiting for his specific transaction to flag in the system. I hung up the phone and leaned back in my chair. The silence in the house was profound, heavy with the weight of impending destruction. Derek was currently sitting in a plush bank office, smiling at a loan officer, entirely convinced that his brilliance had secured his grand escape. He believed he was merely hours away from a payout that would silence his violent creditors and secure his fraudulent empire. He had absolutely no idea that his meticulously crafted lifeline was actually a federal noose, and the trapdoor was about to swing wide open. By Friday afternoon, the tense, suffocating atmosphere in the mansion had completely evaporated, replaced by a manic, celebratory energy. Derek had returned from the bank on Tuesday, wearing a look of absolute arrogant triumph. He firmly believed my forged signature had bypassed the underwriting department and that the $2 million line of credit was quietly processing in the background. In his twisted mind, the violent syndicate was already paid off, and his fraudulent empire was secure. To celebrate his fabricated victory and to secure the next wave of unsuspecting victims, he organized a massive, extravagant gala for Saturday evening. He claimed it was an exclusive investor showcase for his artificial intelligence startup. In reality, it was a desperate, glittering net designed to catch fresh capital. I stepped out onto the expansive rear patio just as the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the manicured lawns. The transformation of my backyard was sickeningly opulent. Derek had spared absolutely no expense utilizing stolen funds to project the ultimate illusion of immense wealth. A massive white silk tent dominated the lawn, illuminated by hundreds of floating fairy lights. A professional string quartet played classical arrangements in the corner, their music mingling with the clinking of imported crystal. Uniformed waitstaff navigated seamlessly through the growing crowd, carrying silver trays adorned with beluga caviar, seared Wagyu beef, and flutes of vintage champagne. It was a masterpiece of deception. I stood near the edge of the patio holding a simple glass of ginger ale. I watched the crowd with a cold, analytical detachment. There were at least 80 people in attendance. I recognized a few prominent local business owners, but the vast majority of the guests fit a very specific, tragic demographic. They were elderly, wealthy retirees. They wore expensive, conservative clothing and moved with a quiet, comfortable grace. These were the innocent people Derek and Natalie were actively hunting. They were the very people whose life savings were currently funding the champagne they were drinking. Natalie floated through the crowd like a vibrant, venomous butterfly. She wore a stunning emerald green designer dress that I knew cost upward of $5,000, purchased entirely with the blood money of the vulnerable people she was currently charming. Her hair was perfectly styled, and she wore a radiant, welcoming smile that completely masked the absolute darkness of her soul. I watched her approach an older couple standing near the ice sculpture. She placed a gentle, reassuring hand on the elderly woman's arm, laughing brightly at a shared joke. She was playing the role of the devoted, brilliant tech wife with terrifying perfection. Knowing what I knew, knowing that she had calmly planned to lock me in a state-run asylum just days prior, her performance made my stomach physically churn. She was a flawless, remorseless predator. Derek was holding court near the center of the silk tent. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. He was surrounded by a tight circle of captivated investors, gesturing animatedly as he spun complex lies about machine learning algorithms, scalable cloud infrastructure, and guaranteed exponential returns. He exuded an aura of unstoppable success. He spoke with the absolute conviction of a man who believed his own magnificent lies. He was completely unaware that his digital footprint had already been dissected by federal forensic accountants, or that his offshore bank accounts had been entirely frozen by international authorities just 6 hours ago. I took a slow sip of my ginger ale, letting the sharp, cold liquid ground me in the present moment. The sheer audacity of their behavior was almost difficult to comprehend. They were standing on a property they no longer owned, spending money they had stolen, and celebrating a future that was about to violently cease to exist. They had built an entire reality out of smoke and mirrors, and they were currently throwing a lavish party right in the center of the illusion. At precisely 8:00, Derek stepped up onto the small, elevated wooden stage that had been constructed for the evening. He tapped a silver spoon against his crystal champagne flute. The sharp, clear, ringing sound easily cut through the murmur of the crowd and the soft music of the string quartet. The guests slowly turned their attention toward the stage, their faces reflecting a mixture of polite curiosity and genuine admiration. Natalie immediately glided through the crowd, taking her place right by his side. She looked up at him with an expression of manufactured, adoring devotion. "Ladies and gentlemen, friends and esteemed partners," Derek began, his voice projecting smoothly through the hidden audio system. "I want to personally thank every single one of you for gracing our home with your presence tonight. We are gathered here to celebrate much more than just a successful business venture. We are here to celebrate the future. We are standing on the absolute precipice of a technological revolution. Our artificial intelligence platform is not just going to disrupt the market. It is going to fundamentally change the way humanity interacts with the digital world." He paused, letting the heavy, impressive words hang in the cool evening air. Several of the older investors nodded in solemn agreement, completely captivated by his magnetic charisma. "But true innovation does not happen in a vacuum," Derek continued, placing a loving hand on Natalie's waist. "It requires absolute trust. It requires a profound, unyielding belief in the people around you. I could never have built this company without the unwavering support of my incredible wife, Natalie. And I could never have reached this remarkable milestone without the deep foundational trust of our early investors, many of whom are standing right here in this very tent tonight." The sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy of his words was staggering. He was openly thanking the very people he was actively bankrupting. He was preaching about trust while actively executing a massive federal wire fraud scheme. "We consider our investors to be an extension of our own family," Derek said, his voice dropping to a sincere, emotional register. "And family is the most important asset we possess. Family protects each other. Family elevates each other. We are building a legacy of wealth, security, and absolute transparency. So please raise your glasses with me. To trust, to family, and to the boundless, brilliant future we are going to build together." The crowd erupted into polite, enthusiastic applause. They raised their crystal flutes, blindly toasting to their own impending financial ruin. Natalie beamed, raising her glass high, her eyes scanning the crowd with a hungry, predatory satisfaction. I did not raise my glass. I stood perfectly still at the edge of the patio, a solitary figure anchored in absolute reality. I slowly raised my left arm and pulled back the crisp cuff of my dark suit jacket. I looked down at the face of my heavy silver wristwatch. The second hand ticked forward with a relentless mechanical rhythm. Bradley Pierce had sent me a coded text message exactly 10 minutes ago. The federal arrest warrants had been formally signed by a judge. The massive, coordinated strike team was already quietly assembling outside. The heavy iron gates at the entrance of the estate did not merely open. They were violently thrown wide, groaning loudly, against massive steel hinges. The sudden, harsh sound tore through the delicate ambiance of the garden party like a jagged knife. For a brief suspended moment, the elegant guests remained entirely oblivious, their attention still fully captivated by Derek and his arrogant, self-congratulatory toast. They continued to smile, raising their expensive crystal flutes toward the elevated wooden stage, completely blind to the terrifying reality that was rapidly descending upon them. I remained perfectly still at the very edge of the stone patio, the cold glass of ginger ale resting comfortably in my hand. I watched the long, winding driveway with the steady, unblinking focus of a hawk. The darkness beyond the fairy lights fractured. A formidable convoy of matte black sport utility vehicles surged forward, tearing up the immaculate gravel driveway with aggressive, military precision. There were no flashing red and blue lights. There were no wailing sirens to announce their arrival. This was not a standard police response. This was a highly coordinated tactical strike designed to completely overwhelm its target before a single piece of digital evidence could be deleted or an offshore account drained. The heavy vehicles did not politely stop at the designated valet parking area. They drove directly onto the pristine, perfectly manicured lawns, their thick tires tearing deep, ugly trenches into the expensive grass. The aggressive intrusion shattered the illusion of the extravagant gala. A collective, synchronized gasp rippled through the sea of wealthy, unsuspecting investors. The classical string quartet abruptly stopped playing, the final discordant scrape of a cello bow hanging awkwardly in the sudden, terrifying silence. The uniformed waitstaff froze perfectly in place, lowering their silver trays of caviar as confusion rapidly morphed into pure panic. The heavy doors of the black vehicles swung open in perfect unison. Dozens of federal agents poured out onto the lawn. They moved with a terrifying, silent efficiency. They wore dark tactical gear, heavy ballistic vests and windbreakers emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They instantly formed a strategic perimeter, securing every possible exit from the sprawling backyard. The soft glow of the hanging fairy lights was violently overpowered by the blinding beams of tactical flashlights cutting through the darkness. The elite guests, the very people Derek had just falsely proclaimed as his beloved family, began to scatter like terrified insects. Women in expensive designer gowns stumbled backward, abandoning their crystal glasses on the manicured grass. Men in tailored suits raised their hands defensively, bewildered by the sudden militarized invasion of what was supposed to be a sophisticated technology showcase. The agents did not pay attention to the panicked crowd. They moved with absolute singular purpose. Their objective was standing in the center of the white silk tent, still holding a silver spoon and a glass of vintage champagne. Derek remained completely frozen on the elevated wooden stage. The smug, victorious smile had been entirely wiped from his face, replaced instantly by an expression of pure, suffocating horror. The crystal flute slipped from his trembling fingers, falling to the wooden floorboards and shattering into 100 glittering pieces. The sound of breaking glass seemed to finally break the spell that held him paralyzed. The absolute reality of his situation crashed down upon him with the devastating force of a concrete wall. His brilliant, foolproof scheme was dead. His offshore accounts were frozen. The violent syndicate was going to be looking for their missing millions, and the federal government had just arrived to collect his soul. He looked frantically to his left and then to his right, his eyes darting wildly like a cornered animal searching for an impossible escape route. But there was absolutely nowhere to run. The perimeter was completely locked down. The agents converged on the white silk tent, their voices barking sharp, unmistakable commands that echoed loudly over the terrified murmurs of the crowd. Derek took one desperate, pathetic step backward, stumbling awkwardly off the edge of the small stage. He landed heavily on the grass, abandoning all pretense of dignity, abandoning the sophisticated persona he had so carefully cultivated. He turned and attempted to sprint toward the rear gardens, pushing roughly past the very investors he had just sworn to protect. He did not make it more than 10 feet. 3 heavily armored federal agents closed the distance with terrifying speed. They hit him with the combined unstoppable force of a freight train. Derek was violently tackled to the ground, landing hard right next to the massive, intricately carved swan ice sculpture. The beautiful, shimmering centerpiece shook from the heavy impact, shedding sharp shards of freezing ice onto his ruined, custom-tailored tuxedo. The agents moved with practiced, ruthless efficiency. They pinned his arms forcefully behind his back, pressing his face brutally into the damp, cold grass. The harsh, metallic ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs locking securely around his wrists cut sharply through the cool night air. The magnificent, arrogant tech entrepreneur, the man who had confidently planned to sell my home to the mob and lock me in an asylum, was now thrashing helplessly in the dirt, weeping openly as the agents read him his federal rights. The charges echoed across the quiet patio. Massive wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, interstate bank fraud, conspiracy to commit grand larceny. Each heavy word struck the final nails directly into his coffin. The glamorous illusion he had built was completely annihilated, leaving nothing behind but the pathetic, sobbing reality of a ruined, desperate criminal. The remaining guests watched in absolute stunned silence, finally understanding that they had almost handed their entire life savings over to a ruthless con artist. Natalie had been standing near the stage, completely paralyzed by the sudden, violent destruction of her perfect world. She stared blankly at her husband, thrashing helplessly on the ground beneath the heavy boots of the federal agents. The vibrant, charming hostess had vanished completely. Her beautiful emerald green designer dress now looked entirely ridiculous, a pathetic costume for a play that had just been permanently canceled. When the agents hauled Derek roughly to his feet and began marching him toward the waiting black vehicles, Natalie finally snapped out of her profound state of shock. She let out a sharp, hysterical scream, a sound completely devoid of any elegance or control. She spun around wildly, her eyes scanning the terrified crowd until they finally locked onto me. I was still standing exactly where I had been all evening, leaning casually against the stone pillar. She picked up the heavy skirt of her expensive gown and began running frantically toward me, her high heels sinking deeply into the torn grass. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, desperate panic. "Dad!" Natalie screamed, her voice cracking as she grabbed my arm. "Tell them it is a mistake. Call your lawyers. Do something right now." I looked at her with completely dead, empty eyes. I slowly raised my glass, taking a very long, quiet sip of my drink. "Why would I call a lawyer for a thief, Natalie?" The words hung in the chilling night air, draining the remaining color from her face. She stared at me trembling as federal agents hoisted her sobbing husband from the damp grass and shoved him into the back of a black vehicle. Natalie fell to her knees, weeping into her hands. I did not move to comfort her. I reached inside my suit jacket, retrieved a tightly folded stack of papers, and tossed them onto the patio. They landed gently at her feet. It was the forged conservatorship petition and the fake psychiatric evaluation. She looked down at the documents, her eyes widening in absolute terror as she realized the complete depth of my knowledge. She looked up at me, opening her mouth to speak, but I raised my hand to silence her pathetic excuses. "I may be old," I said, my voice echoing with absolute, unwavering certainty. "But my mind is sharp enough to know when a snake is biting me, even if it is my own daughter." She flinched, as if I had physically struck her. I took another slow sip of my ginger ale, letting the reality of her total defeat sink in. "You and your husband have spent the last few weeks treating my home like a conquered territory." I continued, gesturing to the lavish white tent and the terrified, scattering guests. "But you made a critical miscalculation. This estate is no longer mine. I legally sold the entire property days ago to a private holding company. The new owners are bringing heavy bulldozers tomorrow morning at dawn. They plan to completely tear down the unpermitted illegal additions Derek built in the rear gardens. Natalie gasped, scrambling backward on the stone patio. Your grand illusion is entirely finished, Natalie, I stated. You currently have exactly 60 minutes to pack whatever personal belongings you can carry and leave this property permanently. If you are still standing on this estate when the clock strikes 9, the federal agent standing right over there will formally arrest you for criminal trespassing. She did not argue. She did not beg. She simply scrambled to her feet and ran frantically toward the massive house, her expensive green dress trailing through the mud. 6 months have passed since that night. The justice system moved with a swift, merciless efficiency. Derek was formally convicted of massive federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. He is currently serving a mandatory 15-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Natalie, facing a mountain of crippling legal debts and stripped of all her stolen assets, was forced into a completely different reality. My former attorneys informed me she is now working the grueling night shift at a cheap roadside diner just to survive. I had my legal team completely rewrite my estate planning documents. She was entirely written out of my will, erased from my legacy with a single stroke of a pen. As for me, the cold, suffocating air of that sprawling mansion is a distant memory. Today I am breathing the crisp, salty air of the Mediterranean Sea. I am standing on the polished deck of a chartered luxury yacht, watching the sun dip slowly beneath the sparkling blue horizon. I walked back into my spacious, quiet cabin, pouring myself a glass of exceptionally rare scotch. I picked up the remote and turned on the large flat-screen television mounted on the wall, selecting my absolute favorite classic history documentary. The soothing voice of the narrator instantly filled the beautiful room, bringing a profound sense of peace that I had not felt in many long years. I rested my heavy glass down on the small wooden table, taking a long, relaxing breath. I crossed my legs comfortably. I finally settled deep into the leather chair and softly smiled. No one in this entire world will ever dare to turn my own television off ever again. Blood makes you related, but true loyalty, deep respect, and real gratitude make you family. When you dedicate your entire life to providing for your children, you quietly pray they grow up to inherit your hard work ethic and your heart. But if they simply choose greed over love and view your kindness as a weakness to be exploited, you must have the absolute courage to cut the cord. Never let anyone, not even your own flesh and blood, strip you of your dignity. The love of a father is boundless, but personal respect must always be guarded and protected. If you have ever had to set a hard boundary with someone you loved to protect your own peace of mind, please hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of justice. Let me know in the comments below right now. What would you have done here?